Hey guys, this is Blue Lotus Art Gallery at Tawasin Mills. They have some beautiful art here at reduced prices. Me and Ekim got a great deal on some beautiful pieces. I highly recommend you check it out. Michael Keeling, how are you doing?
Good to be back. How are you?
Great.
Right on.
So we wanted to start this off with a little explanation of reincarnation from the Buddhist perspective.
Yeah, actually, I figured rather than just like jumping into debate, we should probably first figure out what it is that we're talking about. And you actually know better than I do. I haven't spent a lot of time on reincarnation. I've always had what I think are some simple arguments, not necessarily to show that it's false, but that it's arbitrary. So the first question that actually came to mind right before we started was, maybe you could start with, where do all the souls come from? And I understand that the Buddhist conception of the soul is either absent, and there's something that fits that space. So as you can tell, I don't know.
Right.
The lineage of samskaras, the continuity of consciousness, whatever it is that is continuing throughout a lineage of lives. There's what 7 billion people alive today?
Yes.
So I know that like Hare Krishnas, which when I've talked to them about it, they're probably the only ones I've ever debated on it. Thing is they have a kind of a silly conception that you start with lower forms of like animals and work your way up, which to me is kind of crazy, because how many ants are there in the world? And by their conception, you're an ant once, and then you graduate from anthood up to something else. So if there's like however many trillions and trillions and trillions of ants alive right now,
Yeah.
then there should be an equal number on the next level up.
Right. It makes no sense because there's exponentially, astronomically more, animal species, and
Yeah. So what's
they're all
filtering out
dying
the
constantly.
souls? Do the souls converge? Are you made up of a trillion ant souls to make a human soul?
Yeah, right.
And what I get from them is, well, there's these other planes of existence, so which is just hand waving, right?
Yeah.
So the lineage isn't just on Earth. It goes all over the
That's
place
what
throughout
that's
other
what Buddhism
dimensions.
says too. Yeah. It says
Really?
it's not planet centric. It is only in the sense that karma tends to keep certain souls. Okay, I just used souls from a Buddhist perspective.
Yeah.
It's never used. I've heard one Buddhist monk say the soul is a perfectly good word. You can use it as long as you don't let it confuse you. And it's the same with the self, right? And in a conventional sense, we're all like selves exist,
Yeah.
right? But that's just describing what is, and it causes confusion if you take it to be something concrete, something enduring, lasting, permanent.
So can you distinguish the proper use of the word soul? And I get that that they would say you're kind of using it as a tool in a similar sense that you would be using I and self when also knowing that that's a fiction.
Exactly.
In a sense.
Yeah.
Now, there being no self and there being no soul, these still aren't the same thing to them, right?
It is. It's actually, yeah.
Okay.
The word atta or atman, it means self. It also very much means soul. So when they say anatta, no self, no soul, it's literally the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you familiar at all with Advaita Vedanta?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That I haven't looked a lot into it, but that's much more closer to my view
Okay.
on things. I don't know why I didn't think think about saying that earlier. But tell me how, from the Buddhist conception, in contrast to what seems rather silly from what I get from the Hare Krishnas,
Right.
Where we've got 7-something billion souls,
Right.
and those lineages are traced backwards. Is there, how far do they go? Are they infinitely long prehistories? Where do the samskaras start? Do they start with just a single samskara that pops out of nowhere,
Yeah.
and then it's built on? And
Let's clarify the word samskara too, because that's actually not from the tradition, from the Theravada tradition of Buddhism that I'm familiar with.
Okay.
There is the word sankara, and I've been using them as synonyms, but it takes on a different meaning.
samskara?
Yeah.
Yeah, that I've got from Hare Krishnas. I hope I'm saying it correctly.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
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 What does it mean though?
Well, I would be the wrong person to ask, but basically, I just know that that's the right word to use to talk about whatever it is that is that space of things that continue, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
From life to life.
Yeah.
Right. So I can't tell you how samskaras break down, the nature of them.
Yeah.
That's actually often my question. Is when you take out everything that is not the self,
Yeah.
that is like there seem to be like arbitrarily true facts about a soul, and what's essential that's left when you take out the arbitrary parts, right?
Yeah.
The facts of the history of some soul that are particular to that soul, idiosyncratic. When you take all of those out, what are the inherent properties of a soul?
See, this is
that's
where Buddhism is really, really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because there's whole stories, I don't know if I said this, but of basically a simile used of a king who hears someone playing music, right? And they want to find the source of that music. So they take the performer's guitar, and then they take the strings off, and then they decompose the guitar, and they break it down, and he opens it up and doesn't find the music, and then he burns it and sifts through the ashes and still doesn't find the music, right? And it's the same concept with of a self or a being, right? If you're looking for the soul, the essence of it, you're not going to find it because there isn't any.
Okay.
So how can there be reincarnation?
Yeah. So if there's nothing left, then it seems that there would be nothing left to continue.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So I'll give you the explanation.
Yeah.
Basically, what it says is that the process of being is a bunch of parts, which are called khandas, right? And it's this collection of parts. So you've got form, physical form. In order for there to be being, you need form.
Yeah.
You need.
In my view, there's no such thing as non-form. There's just form.
But let's go through it, right?
Yeah. See,
because they actually distinguish between mental factors and material form and things, right? So it's material form. Feeling is an element of being, right? And feelings break down into the categories of pleasant, painful, and neutral, right? So when there's a being, you're going to have a form. You're going to have pleasant, painful, neutral feelings. There's the next one up is perception. So that's the way that we perceive things. It's an instantaneous process where we overlay. It's almost like naming, right? We look at a cup and it's a cup, right? But it's a cup the second we look at it, even though ultimately, what is a cup, right? A cup is just a process. A cup is glass that is actually a very, very slow moving liquid, which will eventually smash and whatever, be recycled. So, and then those are your perceptions. And then the next one is called volition or mental formations. So that is everything that we do that's habitual, our personality all fits into this category. And then the last one is consciousness. And so when you, in order, like a being has all of these things. It has these 5 what are called khandas, which means groups, basically aggregates. Mm-hmm. And the process of being, the process of being is rooted in like it happens because of ignorance, right? So, and I just want to address what you said about, or your question about where do they come from, right? Mm-hmm. They say that there's no beginning, and I don't know how this makes sense, but they say that beings have always existed, each individual being. So it's pluralistic, right? You've got individual beings that are doing this, and they do this. They wander on endlessly because of ignorance, and because of ignorance, they crave to continue to exist. They crave to experience feeling, pleasant feeling, right? That's why this process of being, the coming together of these 5 aggregates continues.
Do you mind if I ask a question then?
Yeah.
Because that is one of the only so many ways to conceive it, and I've thought of this before. If it goes back infinitely into the past, then nirvana should have been reached an infinite amount of time ago. It cannot take an infinite number of actions to reach a finite goal. If it takes an infinite number of actions to reach nirvana, then you will never reach nirvana, right? If you have an infinite amount of time to accomplish it, then you should have accomplished it an infinite amount of time ago.
Yeah. Interestingly, so I'm not entirely sure I understand your argument, but I actually had a problem with the idea of an infinite past because I don't understand how an individual being could have an infinite past. That means they've done an infinite amount of things. How can you have done an infinite amount of things? Like if it's the past, if it's already happened, then there must be a finite amount of things that you've done. I don't see how because if it's infinite, that means it continues on forever.
It means there's nothing.
It means it's not finished. Yeah. How could it be? If it's already been done, if it is the past, if it is finished, how can it be infinite? It can't be finished if it's infinite.
For all logically doable actions on the part of an infinite being, they would all have to have necessarily been finished an infinite amount of time ago, right? If there's whatever's possibly doable for you, you've done an infinite amount of time ago because you've had an infinite amount of time to do it. So there shouldn't be any next event for you. You've already done it. You finished that an infinite amount of time ago. You already got around to that an infinite amount of time ago.
What they say, though, is that is true about everything except nirvana, and there is also no guarantee that any being will ever reach nirvana. It's the rarest thing. It's the rarest thing that a being can do. Is no guarantee. It's actually highly unlikely.
Well, there's a guarantee that they won't if they haven't yet, if they've been given an infinite amount of time and failed to. If after an infinite amount of time you fail to do something, that means given an infinite amount of time, you will fail to do it, which means you won't do it, right? So that is a guarantee that you won't do it.
I don't see how that could be, because you should be
done by now.
But you're not, and there's no guarantee that you ever will. But the idea is that there is the possibility. So
it's a true statement to say that given an infinite amount of time, you've failed to reach nirvana. So if something, given an infinite amount of time, fails to do something, then for all eternity, it will fail to do that.
I think I see what you're saying, but we're extending this infinity of time into the past, which for me doesn't make sense. I can't wrap my mind around that, because the fact is that despite having an infinite past, you still have a present, and future. So that means there is still opportunity to do the thing called nirvana.
Yeah, well, this is the thing with it's incoherent in my view
Well,
to
me
have
too. I don't get it.
to have persons with infinite histories.
Right. I don't understand
Because
that.
in order to be conscious, there has to be something that you're not yet conscious of, something that you haven't yet done. There has to be some way of having a next moment that you haven't already had, right? So,
I don't.
consciousness needs to begin somewhere with either none or some limited amount of knowledge. That knowledge and experience grows by becoming conscious of things it was not yet conscious of, right? So you could have a finite past and an infinite end is one possibility. I'm actually not sure that consciousness, in terms of there being a conscious being, makes sense in that way either. But consciousness, in my view, and I've never been able to think my way out of this, requires a limited amount of knowledge. And when I say knowledge, I mean in an absolute sense, like all forms of knowledge, like knowing you're experiencing, being aware of, even your knowledge and experience of things that may be false. For you to have a next moment, you can't have already had that moment.
Well, what about the fact that if reincarnation is true and this infinite stream of past lives is true, then your knowledge goes away every time you die. So you never reach that full extent of knowledge, that full extent of experiences, because you get this amnesia, this forgetting every time you have to die and get born again. And in fact, like, that's probably the point of that, is because you have this craving, this desire to continue to exist. So the only way that is possible is if you continuously die and forget.
Yeah. Like Michael Keeling sitting here, if I forgot everything Michael Keeling,
Yeah.
then there's no Michael Keeling part left, right? So some things that I have may go on to someone else who lives a life, has their own personality form, their own experiences, their own memories that they will later forget, but that person didn't bring any of the Michael Keeling part with them. They just got the non-Michael Keeling part of me, right? So like I was saying before, the person who inherited Hitler's soul is not Hitler. Hitler was Hitler. And the person who inherited Hitler's karma doesn't deserve that karma because they didn't do anything to earn that karma. Hitler did, right? But that's on the assumption that there's this thing, this box that to me appears to be empty, of what continues from one person to the next, that necessarily ties two people together. And when I say people here, I mean personalities. So the personality of Michael Keeling is not the personality of the person I'm reincarnated into, or maybe it is. Maybe somebody's born who has my personality in the same way, which would mean somehow, or like some core of my personality, and then that core gets shaped by different experiences or whatever. But that means that there's some some underlying code inherent to me that gets passed on.
They call it karma. Karma is what gets passed on. And also, it's a continuous, I've tried to explain this before, but it's not a new being. So each individual being is an individual. It's a plurality, right? So you, Michael Keeling, are a being. You don't end, according to this, you don't end when your body dies. You're, as a being, simply continue. Consciousness doesn't even cease. Consciousness just goes on. Its memories are wiped out. It's the same being.
Well, what is different, though, from saying, let's say I make up an alternative form of reincarnation, omnicarnation, let's call it, and where when I die, I'm reincarnated into being you. And there's nothing stopping my next incarnation from existing parallel to my current one, right? I don't see any reason why it couldn't work that way, right? Like there's you have to tie the history of this consciousness, this continuity of consciousness, to the history of universe in reincarnation in a way that my omni-incarnation doesn't require.
Yeah.
Like two of my incarnations can exist simultaneously, and when this one dies, it begins at the beginning of your life. And I don't see a contradiction there. But with the Buddhists?
Yeah.
How?
And as I said before we began this, I don't believe this. I don't believe in reincarnation.
Yeah, I'm not asking.
But
tell me your view if you have
absolutely.
something to say on it. But I'm asking, like, what would they say?
Yeah, the way I explained it before is that all the beings that exist right now are individuals. Like you cannot merge them. You cannot create two out of one. They are individuals, individual beings. It's like a river. Yeah. And
is there an argument for that being true, or are those just arbitrary assumptions?
Well, that's an interesting question.
How do they arrive at that claim?
That's an interesting question. Okay, this is where you get into the claim that they make, that this stuff is actually, you can't really hammer it out by logic. The way that you come to know this is through meditation and direct experience of the nature of being through direct observation. And that's their claim to. They also say that the Buddha and the others that awaken by following the path which he described, that they know this stuff about how the process of being works, what the causes of being are, and what each individual being is capable of.
So they know that you can't reincarnate into a body that exists simultaneous with another incarnation. They just know this to be true, and then we have to accept that and hope that with thousands of hours of meditation we're somehow going to come to know how that's true, but we'll never be able to explain it.
Explain what you mean by that. I'm not quite sure. So they enter a body that's already existing with a conscious being.
Yeah, like my next incarnation being the one in front of me. So I'm your birth starts at the end of my death. I don't see a contradiction there.
My birth starts at the end of your death, and because I don't quite explain again.
Well, what the karma that you inherited? How do you know that you didn't inherit it from me?
Right. Okay. So the way they're thinking about it is that one individual like you, like when someone is reborn into a new body, it's the same individual. It's the same person.
Yeah.
So it's you. It could never be somebody else.
Yep.
That's it. That's
it. And so let's say you were born the moment I die. So you don't exist yet. Somebody like you exists in front of me, but then the you that you are right now born in this hypothetical will be born when I die, right? And will come out to be you. Now I don't see a contradiction in that being true of the you that is actually in front of me right now. That later on, from my stream of consciousness, ends and begins with the beginning of yours when you were born, right? I don't see a reason why it will still be true that the part of me that continues, that continued from some other life to this one and on to another one, can't have moved on to the body that's in front of me right now, and I'm looking at myself right now.
Oh, so, but you're talking about some weird, like, non-linearity of time? Like
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
die and go back and become me at my birth?
Well, not go back.
Yeah.
It's not back in terms of the stream of my consciousness. I haven't experienced that yet.
Yeah.
I haven't had the conscious experience that's happening in front of me yet, but I will.
Okay.
You have had my experience,
Yeah.
right? Because you inherited mine. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be the case.
I don't have an argument for why it wouldn't either, but the Buddhists would say it's not possible because each individual is an individual,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you're a continuous process. So when you die, you continue, and when I die, I continue. You will never be me from a Buddhist perspective.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, I'm not yet you.
No, but you will
And
never
you're
be
no
me.
longer me.
You understand what I'm saying? The Buddhists will say that you could never experience my experience. You could never. It's pluralistic. We are individuals, and we always
but
will be.
You have experienced. So there's two hypotheticals here. One where you're born linearly in time after I am, and that you.
No, it wouldn't be me. It'd be you. Like, I don't see why you don't, like, you're not acknowledging, like, the way they see it is that
then
it's one individual.
The person
meaning you.
that I was prior to this life, am I that person?
Yes.
Okay, so
You're that process, because it's not a thing, right?
Yeah,
We talked
yeah.
about that.
So I can have that person's experience. That person can have my experience because we're a single individual.
No, because that event is in the past and has finished. But think of yourself as a single river, right?
Yeah.
A river is not the
I get
same
it.
from.
I just don't understand why it has to be tied to the river of time exterior to my stream of consciousness.
The river of time?
That person, let's say that in my previous life I was Thomas.
Yeah.
Thomas is capable of having Michael Keeling's experience in his next life.
From a Buddhist perspective, the past doesn't exist and the future don't exist.
Yeah, I know. But Thomas can say that in my next life, I will have experiences of recording this podcast under the name of Michael Keeling, and he would be correct in saying that.
Well, think of it this way. A river would be correct in saying, in a month's time, my bank will be 3 meters to the left of where it is now.
Yeah.
And I'll have completely different water molecules in me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is true that Thomas can have Michael Keeling's experience eventually after he's forgotten the Thomas experiences and goes on to the next life.
No, because Thomas is gone. There is
okay.
Thomas was an event, was a river in a certain point in time.
I get it. Thomas is gone. Michael started.
Yeah.
Now Michael is not Thomas.
Exactly. Well, Michael is the same river, but
I agree with that.
There you go.
And so how are you not the same river? How are we not a single ocean? All souls, how are we not one single ocean? Why are we all rivers? How are we not one ocean of souls? And when you remove all the qualities that are Michael, so that you get to that same thing that Thomas, if you removed all the Thomas parts, you would have a singular identity, right? So you'd have one thing. When you remove all the Michael parts, you have that one thing. When you remove all the Thomas parts, you have that one thing that is a singular thing, right? But only in the case of Thomas and Michael, but not Michael and Kellan.
Right.
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 So why not in the case of Michael and Kellan. When I remove all of the Michael parts and you remove all the Kellan parts,
Yeah.
how is that thing left over in your case not identical to the thing left over in my case?
Well, maybe it is. One of the things, one of the descriptions of attaining nirvana, there's the question: how do you save a droplet of water forever? Toss it in the ocean. So it's the idea that maybe nirvana is like entering that ocean. But the reason why we continue to be individual rivers, according to Buddha, is because of ignorance and clinging to being and craving for sense pleasure.
Yeah. Now, it seems that all of everything else that I've heard said from the Buddha would make sense without the reincarnation part. You don't inherit your karma, but you do build karma. You don't start as a blank slate. You start with the DNA you were given, with the body that forms, and the nature, nurture, epigenetics, and so on, and everything else remains true of what the Buddha said, except for this, what to me seems arbitrary, connecting souls in a linear fashion, as if they're all, especially if they're infinite streams from where, right?
Right.
If it's one ocean, then there's all logically possible souls that exist necessarily as possible, possibly experienceable experiences that God can have. And if an omniscience exists, then there is something that it is like to be that being. And an omniscience necessarily knows what it is like to be you, necessarily knows what it is like to be me, and there can never be a time at which that omniscience does not know what it's like to be you, down to its infinitesimally smallest detail. I don't see any the difference between the experience that God knows of being Kellan. There's no quality that I can that itself has properties that would make that experience of being Kellan in the mind of an omniscience that's never failed to exist, because it must exist necessarily for all times that the omniscience exists. That Kellan is numerically identical to the Kellan in front of me. There cannot be a difference. If there's a difference, then that means that there is something that it is like to be Kellan that's possibly knowable, but omniscience cannot know it, right? And there's a sense in which an omniscience cannot know the experience of being anything, because the experience of being Kellan includes the experience of not knowing certain things. But that's the nature of consciousness. The only way that God can have an experience is by forming bubbles of ignorance, right? Within all possibly knowable knowledge are pockets of knowledge that are limited and thus can grow in knowledge, right? So the mind of an omniscience includes all these bubbling consciousnesses. It includes all logically possible consciousnesses. There cannot be one that's possibly knowable that an omniscience doesn't know, right? So and they're metaphysically indiscernible. The pocket of consciousness that is part of the mind of the omniscience and the thing itself, right?
So you have an argument for the existence of this omniscience, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a form. It's kind of an inversion the ontological argument, or the modal ontological argument for the existence of God. The Saint Anselm, I don't want to get it wrong, I think it was the 10th or 11th, I think the 11th century, came up with the ontological argument, which basically is that if it is conceivable that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in conception, in your mind, right? But a maximally great being, by definition, cannot exist purely in the mind. A maximally great being would be greater, if it did exist, than a being that failed to exist. So by definition, the maximally greatest being, a property of a maximally great being, is existence. And the reason why it fails, well, there's a few different ways, but one is that existence is not a property. I don't want to get into that's been rehashed for almost 1,000 years. So, but the modal ontological argument, what's his name? His name's not coming to my mind. The guy who came up with it, which is embarrassing. But it's a more solid form, and to sum up the structure of the argument, it goes: it is logically possible that a maximally great being exists. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists at some possible world. If a maximally great being exists at some possible world, then a maximally great being exists at all possible worlds. If a maximally great being exists at all possible worlds, a maximally great being exists at the actual world. A maximally great being exists at the actual world, therefore a maximally great being exists. And on its face, it seems almost to beg the question, but that's the framework of it. The idea of the ontological argument, or modal ontological argument, is that there is some property P, such that if a being exemplifies P, that being must exemplify P at all possible worlds. And so Alvin Plantinga is the theologian philosopher who came up with the modal ontological argument. And what he argues is that maximal greatness has the property of necessary existence. I don't want to make his argument for him, because it actually is more complicated than the summary. But the way that I arrive at it is it's almost inverted. It's so the outline of my argument would be that it is logically possible that an omniscience exists. If it is logically possible that an omniscience exists, then an omniscience exists at some possible world. If an omniscience exists at some possible world, then all worlds exist at that world. If all worlds exist at that world, then the actual world exists at that world. Therefore, an omniscience exists at the actual world. I've messed that up somewhat. There's a better way to say it. I'm not actually reading it. I should probably read it. But the idea being that a possible world is by definition the maximal state of affairs. So if for something to be possibly true, it needs to be consistent with some maximal state of affairs of some world, right? So if something were true, then other things would have to be true. There would be some state of affairs at which that statement is true. And if that state of affairs is true, there's some maximal state of affairs at which it's true in some world, right? A possible world and the actual world are different in that they by definition are unrelated in space and time. There's one cannot have any relation to the other, but for how close it is indexed to the actual world. So a possible world where everything that is true, all true statements about the world that it is the case that I exist making the statement. There is a possible world where everything is true except one subatomic particle on the other side of the universe is slightly moved, right? That world is indexed very closely to this one because the number of true propositions of that world and this world are identical but for that one statement, right? So worlds don't have locations, and they don't have spatial or temporal relationships to each other. One world doesn't happen after another world, and it doesn't exist outside. Like if you just went far enough in one world, you would exit it and then enter into another one. If you did that, you'd be in the same world. You'd be in a world where if you went this far, you'd end up in a different place. So they're by definition logically independent of each other. So if there's some possible world where an omniscience exists, any logically possible world would be possibly knowable to that God, to that omniscience, down to its infinitesimally smallest detail, perfect fidelity. That omniscience would know what it is like for that world to be real. And it couldn't possibly not know what it's like for that world to be real. If a world is possibly knowable, it must be known to that omniscience. And to an infinite extent, there can't be any part of it that isn't perfectly modeled in the mind of an omniscience. So like the way that we as limited beings with human brains know the world is by creating internal maps, internal models of the world. So like this book is, my experience of it is a holographic projection in my head. And there's a serious lack of fidelity between the information that is encoded in the form of this book in reality outside of my model of the world, and this book as represented in my model of the world that I experience. But for an omniscience, there could not be, by definition, they would be identical. There could not be anything in the actual book that isn't perfectly represented in the mind of the omniscience. If it is possibly knowable for this book to exist, then the omniscience, by definition, knows what it's like for this book to exist. And that's also true of all logically possible worlds. If it's logically possible, then it's logically possible or possibly knowable to an omniscience. So a world, one of which we're in right now, is knowable, as possibly knowable, which means that there is a numerically identical, like indiscernible representation of this world in the mind of God. But you cannot say that representation is of this world and not actually this world, because worlds don't have locations. There's not one inside of the omniscience and then one outside of the omniscience. So an objection that would come to mind thinking about that is, well, I mean, God, sure, this world existed for an infinite amount of time. There's no time at which God did not know this world down to its infinitesimally smallest details. There's no time at which the representation of this world existed. But then at some point in his infinite history, he waves his magic wand and says, instantiate, and then gives it some quality such that the real world that we're living in has some quality that the one in his mind doesn't have. Now, when I've discussed this with philosophers, they'll get stuck on that there must be some quality, but they can't say what that is. So let's just, like, concreteness is the closest thing that comes to a name for this quality, if such a thing exists. I know of no argument or description, defense for there being such a thing as concreteness. Concreteness seems to be indexical. It's only concrete because it's part of the actual world, right? It's concrete in that it's being experienced and known to be the case. But for an omniscience, that's true of all logically possibly knowable things, including a world. But let's say that there is some property, concreteness, and God waves his magic wand, says instantiate, and now it has that property. Now God, what it is like to be God, having instantiated that world, is also possibly knowable to an omniscience. And that time slice of the world of that being that said instantiate and imbued that property on a world, it would have known an infinite amount of time ago the experience of that world having that property of being instantiated an infinite amount of time ago. The representation of the world now instantiated also must have been known by definition to the omniscience, and there could never be a time at which it wasn't known. There can never be a time at which it, in the mind of the omniscience, wasn't known to have concreteness, right? And if it's possible for it to have concreteness and not have concreteness, which to me, that's a meaningless statement. This is just a placeholder word, concreteness. But if there is such a difference, then God would also know what it's like for the world to not have concreteness, right? I'm saying those are identical. You're not doing anything when you're imbuing a world with the property concreteness. That you haven't changed anything. You're just saying a word. Nothing changes. But even if you say that something did change, that doesn't change the fact that God experiencing that world having concreteness would still necessarily be knowledge that has never not existed, right? So this world, if it has concreteness, it's the concrete one that I'm talking about, right? So if there's such a thing as this world in an abstract sense lacking some magical property of concreteness, that's not the world we live in, and that's not the world I'm talking about. I'm talking about the concrete world we live in. So now, that's true of the world we know to be concrete, but it's still true of every logically possible world. If it's possibly knowable for God to know what it's like to have instantiated any world, then that world is known to the omniscience an infinite amount of time ago as being instantiated. So if you had the possibility of this if it was a possibly doable action to instantiate merely abstract worlds into real concrete worlds, then for any abstract world that is merely an abstraction, there is a possible world at which an omniscience exists that imbues that world with concreteness, right? So for every merely abstract world, there is a world at which an omniscience, merely abstract or not, imbues that world with concreteness. And so true of this one. There is some world at which some being imbues that world with concreteness. So this is a concrete world at which a real concrete God imbues that world with concreteness. And for every other world, there's a world where there's a God that imbues that one with concreteness, and it wraps itself right around, and there would be no world that didn't have a corresponding world at which an instantiated God instantiated that one. So regardless of whether or not you want to include this in my view vacuous concept of God instantiating a world with concreteness, whether or not you include that, you still end up in the same place. If it's logically possible, just logically possible, like as in it's coherent, it doesn't require evidence, it doesn't require argument. All it requires is that it's logically possible for an omniscience to exist. Then an omniscience must exist. And it must exist at all possible worlds. But instead of saying, if an omniscience exists, it exists at all possible worlds, I'm saying if an omniscience exists, all possible worlds exists at that world, right? And that would be true of all possible worlds, or it would be true at all possible worlds. So at any possible world, to say that all other possible worlds also have concreteness, it would be true at that world as much as it's true at some other world. To say that God exists is true at one world as it is at any other world. So once you start, the problem that Alvin Plantinga has is that once he's done his argument, he now has to defend how you have things like moral perfection and personhood. And it raises questions such as, of all logically possible gods, why this one rather than any of the other ones, right? You can't have some arbitrary set of properties that a god has necessarily, right? There can't be a necessarily existing being can't have arbitrary properties, because those arbitrary properties have to be true at all logically possible worlds, which means that it is logically impossible for there to be the same God with one of those properties being any different than it is, right? So God that wanted this world to be slightly different from what it is, that God would have to be logically impossible. If God desired the world to be such that it is, then it would have to be logically impossible for him to desire it to be any other way, unless you want to say that for every instantiated world, there is a different God that just so happened, for just pure brute fact, to desire a different world at that world, such that he instantiated a world that the one that instantiated this world didn't, right? There has to be some set of properties. It's very similar to the kinds of questions I have about reincarnation. There has to be some inherent set of properties. And what I do in my argument is I unpack that maximal greatness omnibus bill that Plantinga shoves into the ontological argument, down to a single property. So my argument is saying there is one property, omniscience, such that for a being to have that property is for that being to have that property at all possible worlds. And I've had this. I've been fleshing this argument out since about 1996, 95, 96. And I cannot find a way out of it. There's so many different avenues. All of my arguments against the existence of a personal God all stem from this same idea, right? Does God have a first action? Well, how did he decide on that action rather than the infinite number of other possible first actions he could have? Well, he must have been prepackaged to have that first action. Otherwise, the first action would have been deciding to have that action. Well, what part of his nature made it such that that decision would be the one he had rather than an infinite number of other possible decisions? Well, it's part of his nature. Well, why would he have that nature rather than the infinite number of other natures he could possibly have, right? It's an infinite regress until you get down to just the single property of omniscience. Omniscience is the only property that survives, and it's the only one on which the ontological argument actually works.
I'll have to sit on that one.
Yeah. It's a non-intuitive form of logic called modal logic, or S5 modal logic, and you can work out S5 modal logic from first principles. It's perfectly logically sound. So it is in fact true that if there is some property such that for a being to exemplify that property is for that being to exemplify it at all possible worlds, that being must exist. That being cannot possibly not exist. And that's true of an omniscience, because if you can conceive, if a world is logically possible, then it's possibly knowable.
Knowable in its entirety.
Yeah. If an omniscience is logically possible, then if something is logically possible, then it's possibly knowable to that omniscience. That's by definition, right? So all you need is the logical possibility of an omniscience to prove that an omniscience exists. It's a very interesting quality. Yeah. The ontological argument has remained one of the most fascinating, both ridiculed and fascinated over since Ensemble came up with it. And the modal ontological argument is actually one of the most solid arguments.
Yeah, I may just have to go back to the tape and go over it again, but maybe just try to flesh that out a little bit more. Why does a omniscience logically exist in some worlds?
Well, the only way that you could, here's the thing. You don't have to make the claim that it is logically possible to recognize that the argument is valid. It may be logically impossible for an omniscience to exist, but until you can show that it's logically impossible for an omniscience to exist, you're forced to conclude that if it was logically possible, it would exist, right? So it's inescapable unless you can show that there's something incoherent in the concept. It just simply needs to be a logically coherent concept, omniscience.
So how is it logically coherent?
Well, I don't see how it's not. I can come up with ways in which it starts getting into almost semantic arguments when I look at the closest things to objections to it, because you have to flesh out concepts such as what does it mean for that omniscience to be a being at all, right? The omniscience exists for the omniscience to be happening. Shouldn't it be happening to a being? Shouldn't there be a being that has the property of omniscience rather than omniscience, the property of omniscience itself being the being, right? And what I'm saying is no. I'm saying that omniscience is the one and only thing that neither exists nor fails to exist. It is not happening to a being. It's not a property of a being. It is the property of knowing without there being the knower of all the knowledge. There's nothing there in the same way that there's no soul, no self. So it is similar to what I was saying with the nature of reincarnation, that the experiencer of the experience of the continuity of conscious moments that continues from one life to the next, that experiencer of the experiencing, that object, the subject of the experience, that as a thing is actually just a projection, right? That all non-process objects don't exist. They're projections, right? So the experiencer, that thing that's left, that the experiencing is happening to, there's nothing there that's true of the experiencer of this experience that isn't also true of the experiencer experiencing the experience happening on your side, right? So the omniscience doesn't have some linear chain of experiences. It has all possible chains of experiences. So just like you can index two possible worlds as being like maximally close to each other, which would be something such as everything true of this world is true of that world except for some particle is a Planck length away from where it is in this world. Those two worlds would be indexed next to each other. So too of every possible next moment. So if we took this moment as being a frozen time slice in the continuity of my consciousness, this moment has X many number next moments that it could have, right? So there's one where I pick up this book, and there's one where I don't, one where I put it down here, and one where I put it down here. These next moments are not inherently tied to this one. They're not necessarily following one from the other. They're just indexed closely. So one next moment, logically possible moment, would be the moment where instead of me picking this up, I look in shock and horror into your kitchen and I see a dinosaur pop into existence. That absurd next moment is logically possible. That is just as much a next moment to this time slice moment that I'm in right now. That is just as logically possible as me picking up the book, but it's indexed further away because the number of things that changes from one moment to a next, in terms of true propositions, what's true suddenly in the next moment where a dinosaur pops into existence, there's more new true propositions in that one than there is where my hand moves in this direction rather than that direction, right? These two worlds are much closer to each other, where my hand's here and my hand's here. Those are closer to each other than my hand's here and there's a dinosaur in the room, and my hand's here and there's no dinosaur in the room. So there's all logically possible lines of continuity of conscious moments are possibly knowable to an omniscience. And the knower of those moments is not a thing. It's not just in the same way that there's no self, there's no soul. There's just the consciousness, and the consciousness, part of the consciousness happening, consciousnessing, is this illusion of there being something that has the consciousness, that is doing the consciousness, but in actual metaphysical reality, consciousnessing is simply happening. It's not happening to a thing. It's more like there's a space there for the experiencer of the experience, but that experiencer is the absence of a thing, right? And that same absence of a thing, that potential for consciousness, that thing, if we reify it to be a thing, is numerically identical, an identity, identical to yours, a singular object, right? So you are God when God got around to having that moment of consciousness, and I am God when God got around to having this moment of consciousness. And you can draw these lines of continuity in any logically possible way that you want, and they're all equally possibly knowable to an omniscience. So there's an infinite number of past lives that I've had, and an infinite number of future lives that I'll have. Just like there's some there would be an infinite number of past moments I could have, an infinite number of next moments that I could have, but you can index those in a fashion such that for Michael Keeling to feel like he had a last moment where he was Michael Keeling, there's a possible world at which he had one that was very similar, but for some very small thing, like his hand was over here one moment and then over here next moment, which to give some feeling of credibility to that concept, there's this concept in quantum mechanics of the Boltzmann brain, which is a real physical object in the math, where just simply by the rules of quantum mechanics, if you had, say you had an infinite universe, which we most probably live in, our world is the closest approximation to being infinite. If it's not infinite, everything seems to point at it being infinite, which means that in every direction you go you go far enough in any direction, you will run into a replica of this planet where all the molecules are in the same place. And you keep going and you'll find more and more and more. In every direction from any point in space, it's a hall of mirrors. It's a bizarre concept, but it's a real conclusion of eternal inflation, which is this phase at or right after the Big Bang, where the universe began expanding at an exponential rate. It's hard to get your mind around how that space could expand to become infinite in size in a finite amount of time, but it is actually a thing. It doesn't make sense, but it is a thing. I can explain it to you. But a known conclusion, an unavoidable conclusion, is that from any point in space, that the environment around that point in space is replicated an infinite amount of times in every direction from that point in space.
In our known universe?
Well, no, in the actual universe, because there's an event horizon.
Yeah.
There's a horizon at which, from any point in space, there is a point at which space is moving faster than the speed of light. So that what's outside of that horizon is inaccessible to this one causally, right? There's no causal relationship anymore between what's inside our horizon, outside our horizon. So cosmologists will talk about that as being another universe, and the visible universe being what's within our cosmic horizon.
Okay, right.
And visible only in the sense that it is physically possible for light to have a continuous path from that point in space to us, to where we are in the fabric of space. But the concept of the Hall of Mirrors is mind-blowing. Definitely something you need to sit on. But the Boltzmann brain is an unavoidable object that, given quantum mechanics and virtual particles popping into existence by the rules of quantum mechanics randomly, given enough time, the more space you have, the more instances you have, so an infinite amount of space can cover an infinite amount of time. In that space somewhere, virtual particles will pop into existence for an instant in exactly the same physical form as my brain is right now. And the qualia that happens in that instance of the existence of a Boltzmann brain would be numerically identical to the qualia that I'm having currently right now. And it raises a question, is that Boltzmann brain me? Well, no more so or no less so than this one is me. There's no me here. There being a subject of this consciousness is the illusion. There is no subject of the consciousness of that Boltzmann brain any more so or less so than there is right now of me right here. But the qualia is numerically identical. And qualia does not have a location, just like worlds don't have locations, right? The qualia isn't the physical brain may or may not, I believe it is, creating the projection that is the qualia. But it's not like there's like a screen on which it's being projected inside my brain, and it's not happening here. It's only happening here. No, it's not happening anywhere. It's non-local. It doesn't have a location. So it's equally true that this time slice here is me, as it is an infinite amount of times in every possible direction. A numerically identical experience of this experience is the same experience, but manifesting itself in multiple locations, right? So if you have in every direction from any point in space, you travel far enough, you will find a planet Earth where all the molecules that make up everything on the planet, including the people, are identical to that which is right here. And which one is you? None of them are. None of them are. There is no you. So what say you? there's a there's a point at which I can just keep trailing on. Is there a question?
I was just thinking about something I had read about the possibility of a geocentric universe, where I think the concept was that the universe is some kind of a self-contained system where space is curved in just such a strange way that if you went one direction long enough, you would hit the backside of the planet Earth. But according to this idea, it would be, I think, the same Earth. So it's just a different model.
We know that there's two forms of space. Let me see if I can remember what they're called. There's I want to say Hilbert space, but I'm not sure if that's. There's
Your Hall of Mirrors description made me think of that, obviously.
Yeah, the Hall of Mirrors is closer to what we measure.
Yeah.
Right. The universe is either flat in all directions, or it is the word's just escaping me. De Sitter space, which is space is curved. So if it's curved in any way, it would curve into a sphere.
Yeah.
So on flat Euclidean space, two parallel lines will never meet. In De Sitter space, if it curves at all, the degree to which it curves is the degree, the overall diameter of it. Parallel lines will diverge. In anti-De Sitter space, it's like a saddle. Instead of it bending inward, creating a sphere, it bends outwards and makes like a saddle kind of space. And parallel lines in De Sitter space on a sphere, parallel lines would converge. On anti-De Sitter space, they would diverge. And this is what we're talking about are Euclidean topology, or Euclidean flat space. De Sitter and anti-De Sitter are like 2D ways of talking about the shape of 3D space. So when I say space is flat, it's kind of like these are just analogies to it, right? Like they're not metaphors; they're analogies. So we can there are ways of like triangulating space. I can't remember exactly how it's done. But there are ways of measuring the shape of space, and given the acceleration of the expansion of the universe and the dark energy that is like the cosmological constant at which the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate, so the acceleration is accelerating, which should have the universe be homologous, right? The flat space, it should expand so that everything is flattened out, which would mean it would be infinite. In De Sitter space, it's finite because it curls back in on itself. And we, from our measurements of both the expansion of the universe and these triangulation calculations that I'm not sure I fully understand, by all our measurements, it appears that if there's a margin of error, which But within that margin of error, you can either say that it's near infinite or actually infinite. And what's crazy is that there's so many de Sitter and anti-de Sitter spaces that we could exist in, and only one flat infinite space, right? There's whatever degrees of curvature, there's a sphere, right? And same with the de Sitter space. I'm not sure if there's an infinite number of de Sitter spaces. Yeah, topology is not my thing, but there's the degree to which it's curved has, for every degree, there's a sphere big enough that to represent the curvature. But there's only one flat, right? So it seems as though of all the logically possible universes that we could be in, we ended up in a very, very special one. But here's the thing. In that special one, all physically possible Earths exist an infinite amount of time in that one flat space. So you have an infinite number of chances of landing in that one of an infinite number of spaces, right? So it seems as though the universe being flat and infinite is one singular special case of an infinite number of spaces we could be in, but in that one space includes an infinite number of opportunities to exist, right? So of course we find ourselves in that one infinite space because there's an infinite number of all physically possible beings inside that one flat space. That doesn't mean that there's only one flat space. There's like one flat universe, right? There can be flat universes that have different physical laws that are also infinite and flat spaces. But there's only one way to be flat, and there's many ways to be curved, right? So it seems on its face that just by odds, we should find ourselves in one of the many ways that it's not flat. But the nature of a flat universe includes an infinite number of opportunities based on the physical law of that flat universe for everything that's physically possible within that set of laws. Everything that's physically possible must exist an infinite number of times inside that space. So again, it's like if it is logically possible for beings like us to exist, there's an infinite number more of us in a flat universe than there are in a finite universe. But there's also an infinite number of worlds with an infinite number of finite universes to make an infinite number of opportunities for us to exist in finite universes. The thing is, though, is that it's a greater infinite of the infinite number of flat worlds that include an infinite number of physically possible humans. Infinities aren't all the same size. Some infinities are bigger infinities than others. So like the set of integers and the set of natural numbers, which one is bigger than the other? Like that, to put it easier to understand, the set of even numbers is a smaller infinite number than the set of whole numbers. So one infinity is greater than the other infinity. So we're of the worlds that have of all the infinite worlds that have an infinite number of opportunities for you to exist in, you must exist in the one that has the greatest infinity the greatest of all the infinite worlds. It must be the greatest infinite. The greater the infinity, the more likely that you must exist in it, even though in every space in which there's an infinite number of opportunities for you to exist, you must exist an infinite number of times. Well, a case in which there's an even greater infinity, so an infinite number of those infinite worlds, you must exist in that one. It's again very much like a ontological argument. If it's logically possible for that to exist, that must be where you are. It's there's a have you heard of the Doomsday Argument? It's very similar, and it's really interesting, less metaphysical example of this kind of reasoning. Of what is it called? It might occur to me the category of arguments that this falls into. They're it'll come to me. The Doomsday Argument says that if the population of humans has been growing exponentially, right? So if you were to randomly land anywhere in this exponential line, the chances that you're going to be one of the 200 humans way back when is infinitesimally small compared to the chances that you are on the knee of the curve, right? And which means that if you just randomly landed somewhere, the chances that you land at the peak of the population is where you would have to most reasonably conclude that you would find yourself. So if there is a future a trillion years from now, where there are trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions of humans, the chances that you would land here are vanishable, laughable, right? There are some objections to it that I find somewhat convincing, because what humans would be in that world is very different than what they would be here. So one of those beings asking themselves where they would land is a different question than a human of our nature where we would land. Well, it's not likely at all that we're going to land. We're not going to land prior to the existence of humans. That's not in the set of possible instances at which you're going to find a human. And a trillion years from now, you're not going to find humans, right? But the argument still stands in a sense that we must be, not must, but statistically speaking, it's most probable that as this form of human being, that is Michael Keeling, most likely exists at the time at which there's the maximum number of humans of this nature, which means that we're not at the like an exponential growth. We're at the peak, and it must go down. We're at the time slice of that duration of the existence of humans that is at its peak, most likely. You're less likely to be away from that peak than you are to be at that peak.
Likely. So that's a probability, but it could kind of be the gambler's fallacy too.
I don't think so. No, that wouldn't be that certainly isn't one of the arguments. It's not that because
we exist now, it's likely that that we're near the end of that we're
that
at the peak?
that we're due for a doomsday.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily say that. It doesn't have to say that.
No.
It just has to say that the more opportunities there are for a human to exist at one time is where the majority in the history of all humans, the maximum number of humans are going to exist where the maximum number of humans all exist simultaneously, right? So it draws a bell curve. And I don't take it for granted because it doesn't have to mean that humans stop existing, right? But it's a self-selecting hypothesis, or a self-selecting bias, like a form of anthropic reasoning, and it's what it is that you're selecting for makes all the difference, right? So if you remove all the properties of being human and then you just say a place to be conscious, well, if there is a future of this universe that includes trillions and trillions and trillions of consciousnesses, then you should exist there. But again, with quantum immortality, that doesn't mean that you won't. You might. This might be the early history of a consciousness that exists here and also there, right? 1 trillion years from now, there could be 1 trillion beings that can trace themselves back to some earlier point, and some of those beings are going to have trillion-long lives, and those trillion-long live consciousnesses have the equal probability of existing at that time as one that's 1 trillion minus 1 and 1 trillion minus 2. They all have equal probability of existing parallel to each other where there's 1 trillion lives. So I guess in a sense that's kind of another way of arriving. I mean, the quantum immortality I'm just thinking out loud. Seems to
for anyone
get
who
around
missed
some
that,
objections.
Can you explain quantum immortality?
So quantum immortality comes from a thought experiment of quantum suicide, where it's like Schrodinger's cat, where you have a cat inside of a box, and depending on the decay of some unstable element, if one molecule or atom decays in this other box, it'll set off a switch that will produce gas inside the box and kill the cat, right? But you can't know whether or not a particular atom has decayed inside that box is undetermined until you observe it. So if you make a macro world consequence of whether or not some atom decayed, which is the gassing of the cat in the box, then that means that you cannot know whether the cat is alive or dead inside that box until you open it. Quantum suicide is where you put yourself in the box, in a sense. What you would do, and this is just hypothetical, you set up a machine gun that's pointed directly at your head in such a way that it's guaranteed to kill you if it goes off. And depending on the decay of some atom in that same box, it'll set off that gun and shoot you. Now, from the experience of the cat, you being on the end of the gun, you should experience all the quantum events that include that experiment failing. So an earthquake, the gun fails. What you should experience as the cat in the experiment should be like the decay of the atoms in the box is guaranteed given some half-life, right? So we know that they're going to eventually decay, but they'll all of the quantum events that leads to you being killed are all the ones that you can't experience. So for every atom that decays, there are observers of the experiment who watch you get killed, right? But from inside the box, you can't experience any of those. You'll experience every variation, every quantum event that it doesn't include you dying. So you should hear click of the gun failing, or there's an earthquake or lightning strikes or all of the quantum physically possible events that could interrupt you dying. But for everyone that survives, there's some uncountable number of yous that had to die for that one to survive, right? And it paints a picture of a subjective world in which it's true that this ride will never end. There will always be some next moment in quantum histories that includes you.
Isn't it possible that for certain beings, though, even it being the case that you will only experience the one that survives, that no matter what, there is an eventuality? Like, say that the world explodes and...
They're called cul-de-sacs.
Cul-de-sacs,
This is a form of objection to it. There's a few objections that have some legitimacy, and I think they deserve to be considered. Say, for example, what about all the events where the experiment fails in just the right way that you're maimed but still survive? So the earthquake happens, the gun fires, just misses, and you're still conscious, but you're completely maimed and you can't speak, and all of those possibilities are also next moments subjectively that would be filtered out as well, where the consciousness continues, but almost unrecognizably so, right? You got locked-in syndrome or something. Now, the way I get around that idea, I'm not saying that that's not true. It would be true. But the only one that a trillion years from now can look back on is the one where a trillion years from now you continue. So you might have locked-in syndrome for a trillion years. But it's complicated to explain why I find there's only so many ways of having locked-in syndrome. It's a narrow band of conscious experience you're going to have over a trillion years, and that band will just keep repeating itself. You'll run out of experiences at some point in the future, right? If that line were infinite, you would go through all possible experiences you can have in that narrow band of experiences you can have with locked-in syndrome. You would go through those an infinite number of times, but it would be a smaller infinite than the you that kept expanding in your ability to be conscious and have experiences. The bandwidth that you would have if you remained healthy, there would be a much greater infinite number of experiences that would eventually, given an infinite amount of time, begin to repeat themselves. That infinite number of experiences would be a greater infinity than the infinity of experiences that you would have within that narrow range of locked-in syndrome. So what it leads me to is this idea of there being like a maximally great Michael and a maximally great Kellan. So there's some trillion-year-old Michael that I'm inevitably going to reach. And all the other Michaels will be filtered off relative to the reference frame of all the non-Michaels. They'll all witness a Michael dying.
What about if it's not physically possible to extend the human life, to extend your life that long?
Well, we know that in this universe that is true. The universe will reach heat death, thermodynamic equilibrium, where the universe has expanded so much that the space between atoms will be so far that the likelihood that any atom will bump into another atom and create a physical event is vanishingly small, and becomes increasingly more vanishingly small, to the point where it's possible that protons don't decay. It seems unintuitive that protons don't decay. If they don't decay, then what you would end up with is every atom would decay down to protons, and you would have a world with just the like non-mass particles like light, but timelessly. There would be no events among them, and just protons floating. Protons being the only particles having any interactions with the Higgs field at that point. But we don't know how, but I think a lot of physicists assume that protons at some point do decay in some manner. But it takes some incredible length of time. So at that point, no physical events can happen that aren't of the sort of like the Boltzmann brain. So physical continuity of Michael Keeling does have an end in this universe. But that doesn't mean that the subjective experience, the subjective continuity, can't continue in other universes, right? They're numerically identical. They are an identity to the same continuity of experience in some other possible world, right? So for every possible world in which I die, this is the possible worlds version of the physical, the quantum mechanical argument. For every possible world in which I die, there's a possible world at which I continued. And the moment prior to my death, or some moment prior to that death, is numerically identical to the qualia of experience of that moment in a world at which, at that point later in time, I continue to live, right? So in a possible world semantic sense, possible world semantics being the logic of possible worlds, it is equally true that this ride will never end. There's always some logically possible next moment of Michael Keeling.
Just so I'm clear too, the possible worlds, it's the possible worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, right?
No, that's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Oh, possible worlds is...
Possible worlds, in many worlds, there's a world for each quantum event. So in the probability cloud of some particle in a field, that particle doesn't exist in one location rather than another. It exists to some degree in some location and a lesser degree in this location. But it exists to some extent in multiple locations. And the many worlds interpretation just leaves it at that. Other interpretations of quantum mechanics try to add math into it to try to explain how you get from this probability cloud to a definite position, right? Because when we go to measure the position or velocity of a particle, we get one answer. But we can show that prior to having measured it, it was in multiple places until we measured it. And the many worlds interpretation basically says, no, what you're finding, you're just finding yourself in the world, observing it being in that location, and there's a world for every history of that particle, right? So a particle doesn't have a single history between point A and point B. It has all possible histories, and we live in one of those histories, right? So when you go and measure it, there's a U that measures it to be here, and a U that measures it to be here, and a U that measures it to be here for all the locations that it could be in.
Is that
there's
also
a world in which it's true that it is at the location.
Is that also the basis for your or the what was the other one? The possible worlds.
Yeah. That's where I started.
Yeah.
I started from just reading about Richard Feynman's sum over history technique for working out the calculating the probability cloud. So that you would sum over all possible histories of a particle I don't think I'm not even going to try to explain how it works functionally, because I know that I misunderstood it when I first read it. I'm not using Feynman's sum over history to come to this conclusion. It was just the idea of multiple histories existing in a physical sense simultaneous to each other that blossomed all of this, right? So there's senses that are, known conclusions from quantum mechanics where it is physically true. You can make arguments of my sort in a physical sense, but I graduated to making them in a metaphysical sense. And in the metaphysical sense, unless you can argue that there's some substance to the concept of concreteness, then mine stands. The only assumption that I'm making is to not make the assumption that there is concreteness. So I'm actually making one less assumption than any other metaphysics. You remove the quality of concreteness. That's one less assumption. It's more parsimonious. There's no justification for having that as an actual property. It's an indexical property. It's only a statement true because you're in that world, right? The actual world is only actual because it's true to say that this is the actual world from the frame of reference of the person saying it, right? But in some other possible world, when that Michael says that that's the actual world, he is also correct, right? It's indexical. What exists for that Michael is true in that world and false in this world, right? It's just indexical. It's just
but the assumption of many worlds, the assumption of all possible worlds existing.
It's the same thing. It's a lack of an assumption. So the many worlds interpretation just takes quantum mechanics at its face and doesn't add in additional math to create what's called the waveform collapse, right? That the probability cloud collapses into one actuality.
Yeah.
You have to add math into that. You have to add a description of that process. The
But
many
you
worlds
didn't make this
interpretation
up, that
removes. No,
I've heard people saying that all possible worlds exist, and that's an implication of quantum physics.
No, those are all physically possible worlds.
Physically possible.
Yes, and the many worlds interpretation doesn't say that all physically possible worlds exist, just that all of the physically possible quantum events coming from one event to the next exist, right? So there's some set of worlds that can all trace themselves back to our Big Bang, and that doesn't necessarily include all physically possible worlds, but could. Right, and there's a great book to read on this called Our Mathematical Universe by Max Tegmark, and he goes through 4 different types of possible worlds. The first being just simply living in that flat space. You have an infinite number of copies. Like there's an event horizon. around every point in space. And beyond that, you have budding universes. Like I was saying, that hall of mirrors. You have an infinite number of Earths in every direction. And then the second level of multiverses is where you have the many worlds interpretation true in all of those worlds, right? So if many worlds is true and the universe is infinite, then you have an infinite number of universes that have an infinite number of, or that have the maximum number of histories of that universe. So there's an infinite number of sets of possible histories of an infinite number of worlds. And then the third is that there's like budding universes, like wholly separate Big Bangs. So like Lee Smolins we talked about, where at the singularity of every black hole is the Big Bang of another universe. And so you have this history of universes that give birth to black holes that give birth to universes that then make more black holes to give birth to new universes. And that's the level 3 multiverse. The level 4 for him is the mathematical ensemble. So he treats the universe as a mathematical object. And this is where he and I agree. And this is where you get to the question of substance, that we all have this assumption that there's a medium in which matter exists, and there's a substance that is matter that isn't there for energy. And there is no such substance. The only thing that mathematicians have ever found is just math, is just information. The space is filled with quantum fields, and those quantum fields have a number assigned to each point in space, and that number is just simply a description of what numbers are at some other point, right? They're true relative to each other. It's just information about information, but not about some substance.
Sounds like you're saying the universe is a big digital thing.
Yeah, and the holographic principle is that it is. In fact, there's another really good book. What is it called? I read it a long time ago, but basically, it's one of the guys involved in quantum computing. Computational universe, I can't remember what it was called, but basically he's saying that the black hole is a computer, a quantum computer. And I read it a long time ago, so I may be actually inventing how far he goes with it. He doesn't go as far as I'd like him to. He's a little too modest about it, in my opinion. So if I had to just redraw it myself, that holographic principle, that at an infinite amount of distance away from any point in space, there's a horizon at which on the 2D surface of that horizon is the digital 2D dimensional like pixelized representation of the voxelized 3D space. That the foundational reality of the universe is actually the surface of that infinite sphere, rather than in the third dimension. The voxicality of it is actually just a projection. That all the information for our 3D space is encoded in 2D in pixels on that surface, and that's very digital. We're living in pixels, like literally living in pixels. We're information stored on a film in 2 dimensions of pixels. And the third dimension is a projection. It has this intuitive isomorphism to that idea of consciousness, the bubble of consciousness that expanding, projecting creating the illusion of there being a subject of that consciousness, that the self is the illusion, that is the projection of this expanding bubble. It projects as if it's happening to someone, right? When in fact we know, like, in neuroscience, we know that our conscious mind observes our making a decision after they can observe our brain having made the decision. So there's a gap there. That we made a decision is an illusion. It already happened before we consciously observed it. And that's my, I can't flesh out, I can only flesh out the form of what I hope might one day be an argument for how consciousness is projected. But it's our nervous system is encoding information about the outside world. Every form, every physical form is information. It encodes information. You can retrieve from the form of this book information about the world and about its history and about its future, roughly, right? Like, it will decay. That it somehow found its way into this form. Every physical form, what makes the form is the information. And nervous systems, and the system of a plant, like we were talking about before, when you heat one side of a plant, the information that gets stored on that side of the leaf is information about where the heat is, and that information changes the form of the plant, and it grows in the direction of that heat. The information about where the heat is stored in the form of the plant. The nervous system is developing in the same way. It's taking in information from the outside world and storing that information transformed into like some isomorphic form that has an isomorphic representation to the outside world. So there's information coming in through the five senses. That information changes the structure of the nervous system so that if it's one way, a dendrite might form this way, and if it's another way, it might form this way, kind of thing. That's how that information is being stored inside the brain. That as the nervous system becomes more and more complex, part of the environment that it is modeling, like storing information about, is itself. So it's storing information about how it is storing information. So the modeler is modeling the modeler. And when you get to the level of human consciousness, you have such incredible computing power and storage capacity that the information coming in through the five senses, going through all these transforms and algorithms that lead to your decision, that lead to your actions, is happening so fast that the gap between the information coming in, going through all these transforms through your nervous system, leading to an action, and then you observing the action, that gap is so small that to the observer, it seems simultaneous. We witness the decision we made a fraction of a second after it's already happened in our physiology. But it's so fast that we're incapable of perceiving that gap. So it gives this illusion of there being this making decisions and witnessing the decisions as being simultaneous events, when in fact they're not. We witness them after they're made. And that's what gives the illusion of the self, of a homunculus inside our brain making the decisions. We feel like the decision and the observation of the decision are simultaneous events, but that's only because they happen so fast we can't see the gap. If we saw the gap, then we would be witnessing what our body is doing. And that's what you're doing. That's what I'm doing when I meditate, is pulling back to just witness my thoughts happening to me. I can draw that back to God too. Even an almighty God cannot author his own nature. He cannot author his own thoughts. He cannot decide what his next thought will be, because he has to decide what that decision will be. There's an infinite regress. He has to think of what his next thought will be. God cannot know what its next thought will be. It's logically impossible. Free will is logically impossible. And the reason, and another way of saying that is because there's no willer there. That's an illusion. There's no author of the thoughts. The thoughts are just simply happening. So there's the consciousnessing, but no consciousness-er.
Do you want to know an interesting fact?
Yeah.
Buddhists actually, despite believing in no self, they do believe in sort of not free will, because it's not just you can do anything. They believe that there's an extraordinary amount of influence from the nervous system and the environment, but the whole concept of karma, right, is that it's based on there's this being, right, and it can actually act, and it can actually act in a moral or immoral way, and those the consequences of those moral and immoral actions, they follow that being. So they don't believe they don't look at things in a deterministic way.
Yeah. This is the thing. The karma seems like an arbitrary indexing system, right? They're drawing lines of continuity of consciousness, and what I'm saying is you could draw those anywhere, and they're equally true, right?
Well, that is if say determinism is true, right? Buddhists don't believe that things are deterministic. They believe that there are individuals which are distinct and that have the capability, have certain agency.
Yeah, and that to me is an illusion.
Yeah.
But there is this surrealism part of the modal surrealist ontological argument is it comes with another supplementary argument, and I believe I can defend this, and it's kind of laughed off when I've raised it to like my metaphysics professor. Logic does not exist, therefore logic exists. Perfectly sound. That is a sound argument. Logic does not exist, therefore logic exists. If logic didn't exist, then all things would follow and not follow from all other things. Everything would be pure absurdity. And within that pure absurdity is logic existing.
Interesting.
Yeah. Logic is the one. So that is my answer to one objection that could be raised. These aren't objections that people have raised. These are objections that I've raised in thinking, trying to find objections myself. You could say, you could try to say that what I'm doing when I talk about the omniscience is I'm just personifying in some sense logical possibility. So I'm personifying logic. I'm saying, I'm just taking modal realism, that all logically possible worlds are equally concrete, and personifying it and then calling that a mind. I'm not. Logic not existing entails that logic exists, but logic not existing would also be true. The omniscience neither fails to exist nor exists, whereas logic fails to exist, and its failure to exist entails its existence. It's like one step above the omniscience. The omniscience is the absolute fullness of all possibilities that all cancels out to an absolute absence of all possibilities. It's pure potentiality, to again sound like Deepak Chopra. It is just pure energy, pure potential for logical potential, right? Whereas, like, pure energy is the potential for action in a physical sense. Well, I'm talking about metaphysical potential. So God is pure metaphysical potential. So all logical possibilities are that thing, the potential for them. And the potential necessitates the actuality of it, right? Just like if it is possible for that being to exist, that being must exist. That is the omniscience. The one thing, the one and only object of discussion that you can say neither exists nor fails to exist. Now, I scooted past it, and I meant to transition into this. There's an implication that I visited earlier that I'd love to compound on, because it seems like for the longest time it seemed like, okay, so you've solved metaphysics, you're done, like we solved optics and now physics is over. But the maximally great being, as a nondescript person, is incoherent. And the reason why it's incoherent is that it all cancels out to that pure potentiality. It cancels out to that perfectly calm mind, of which all logically possible knowings are all happening simultaneously and canceling out to be knowing nothing. But that doesn't mean that there aren't maximally great beings, but they're finite. Well, not finite. They're smaller infinities. Analogous to levels of infinities. So omniscience is the one that includes all of them, and the only way that an omniscience could know anything is by deleting information such that it can then regain that information, right? So there should be a maximally great Michael Keeling. There's some maximal growth from this point in a sequence of conscious experiences that is as great as Michael can get, right? You can and then you can use the ontological argument to suppose that some such being exists, but there's an infinite number of those. And one of them is the maximally great Michael. There's the maximally great Kellan. There's the maximally great, point out from any point in consciousness. From any point, from any conscious moment, there's some growth where you take that pocket of consciousness and you grow it to some maximum. So in some sense, rather than there being some maximally great being that you can pray to, there is a maximally great being, there is a maximally great you that in some sense you can pray to. And when I say pray, you're not having a conversation with the future you, but you do have a way of accessing what the maximally great you is, right? So the maximally great you, to get from here to there, there's a longer path to get there, or a harder path, If I watch Kellan totally degrade and start smoking and drinking and not taking care of himself, I'm watching Kellan that has more ways of exiting my timeline than the one where I watch a Kellan be healthy, take care of himself, and get along in the world. There's fewer ways that you can take care of yourself to eventually be 1 trillion years old than there are ways that you could die anywhere between now and 1 trillion years from now, right? So there's like a whatchamacallit, there's like a compass, right? There's a moral and behavioral compass that points towards the maximally great Kellan. And the maximally great Kellan has a history of making better choices than the less than maximally great Kellan. So histories that include you making a good decision are ones along that path that leads to 1 trillion-year-old Kellan. So you have an internal compass, having the capacity to reason through. When you have a set of decisions to make, there's a compass of survival that goes back to the beginning of life, that like every single one of your ancestors found a way to reproduce. All the ones that didn't get fucked aren't your ancestor by definition. And that's the compass of the DNA molecule. And there's a compass that you have access to through your rational faculties when, to the extent of your rational capacity, deciding between two paths of action. One of them is more likely to lead you to 1 trillion-year-old Kellan than the other. And it gives you this compass that you can consult. So it's like God's law is written on your heart. So what I would say to somebody who believes in a personal God is that compass that they have isn't written on their heart by some other guy. It's written in the history of the future you, right? And God, the maximally great being, well, each one of those histories is one of an infinite number that's included in that one being, right? So you're not going to get much from God because God also knows the you where you died at 1 trillion minus 1 and 1 trillion minus 2 and 1 trillion minus 3. He knows all of those equally well as the one where of trillion minus plus 2, right? He also knows what it's like to be you burning in hell for 1,000 years, right? So you're not going to get from God a compass. It all cancels out. All the histories of Kellan are included in the mind of God. But in the mind of 1 trillion-year-old Kellan, there's only so many past Kellans, and you have access to that. You have access to the directionality of the maximally great Kellan.
Cool.
Yeah. Now the thing is I do have like, what does it mean? What will a 1 trillion-year-old Kellan look like? Well, it's not going to look anything like this, right? There's a bandwidth to your capacity to be conscious given the body and form that you have now, right? That if you kept the same body that you have right now, you have the capacity for only so many experiences. If you existed for an infinite amount of time, you would just be repeating that number of experiences an infinite number of times, right? So the Kellan that keeps this body has a bandwidth of this size that is a smaller infinity of repetitions of experiences than a Kellan with an expanded capacity for consciousness, right? So a trillion-year-old Kellan is not going to be in a human body with five senses and only capable of inputting and transforming X amount of information. That's going to expand, right? But I do believe that there's a vanishing point. And this is just intuition, that you can't extend the bandwidth to infinity, without losing what it means to be conscious. The bubble must be finite. The bandwidth must be finite, which means that there's some infinity at which it's no longer going to make sense to call this Kellan or even a conscious being anymore. And at infinity is where you reach the omniscience, right? So it can never reach infinity.
I brought up one issue with the concept of omniscience to Eckham.
Yeah.
So you and me are conscious individuals, right? And I said, can you pay attention to two completely different things at one time? Because we only seem to have one cone of attention, right? One point that we're paying attention to. So I said, like, imagine there's one guy walking down one street and another guy walking down another street. Could you pay full and complete attention to both of them at the same time? Can you conceive of how that might be possible?
Yeah, that's like the Nagel's question. Can you know what is there such a thing as what it's like to be a bat? And by definition, it's logically impossible for you to know what that is, because for you to know what it's like to be a bat includes what it is like to not be Kellan. And yeah, I've tried to cover that objection earlier, and that's what I mean by it's not an objection to omniscience as such. It's it's true that you can't both be conscious of being Kellan and be conscious of being some bat at the same time. By definition, because these are different bubbles of consciousness. One by definition excludes the bubble that includes the knowledge of being a bat. Well, the omniscience includes all the bubbles. So there would just be one moment at which all possible conscious experiences happen in that one moment. So it's not so much a contradiction, because the experiencer is a projection from the surface of the bubble, right? There's no experiencer. You never were Kellan in the first place, and the bat was never that individual experiencer either, right? There's only one experiencer, that's God, which is the nothing that it all kind of collapses into at the equilibrium, where all logical possibilities all cancel each other out. It's, you could say, well, doesn't that mean that, there's no God there? Well, yes and no. It's the question of existence doesn't apply to that thing. It neither exists nor fails to exist. It's the one and only thing of which that's true.
Yeah, I'll have to think a lot about that, I think.
Yeah. It's like a nothingness that is an absolute fullness. Just like in our earlier podcast where I talked about the high volume of two speakers pounding the inverse waveform of sound at each other, you get silence in the middle. Well, there's this high volume of air pressure that cancels out in the middle. That silence in the middle is constructed out of loud volume, right? So that fullness of sound, it becomes an absence of sound, but that absence of sound is constructed from a fullness of sound.
And you're thinking of it as one thing, one great big thing. So it's what someone like Ekam says is the one. Like God is the oneness of everything.
Or the Brahman.
Brahman, yeah. Okay.
It's a lot to sit on. I would say it's worth listening to this over again and sitting on it and asking more questions, because the way I'm presenting it is actually not bad compared to ways I've presented it before. But it took me to get this description to be able to articulate it this well. It has taken me since 1995, 96. So that's a long time.
Yeah.
Right. So to have a grasp on it the way that I do might take you some fraction of that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And didn't you have a mushroom story that you wanted to tell?
That would open up a real can of worms. I can go for it. So me and an ex-partner of mine got some shrooms together, and we were going to go hiking up this intermediate level hiking path, and they were sourced from, I think, 3 different places. Or no, the shrooms were of 2 different places, and we also took cannabis edibles, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody told me that there was actually peyote or something else in one of the shrooms. So we were hiking, and it's hitting us just as we get to the top, where we're lying on some rocks around this beautiful lake that's way up this mountain. So beautiful. And then all of a sudden, we had run out of water, and I could feel the dehydration. We brought what was a relatively decent amount of water for that period of time. But we had run out, and I could feel my tongue sticking to the back of my throat, and it was alarming. And when you're really high on shrooms, you have to remember that you could be, you might not be properly paying attention to possible dangers, right? So it was coming to me like, okay, I may not be the right authority on how dehydrated I actually am. This tongue sticking to my back of the throat thing is alarming. I don't know how bad that is, so I'm going to just increase my alert, the alert to maximum, right? We need to get some water. So I get up and go to jump to the next rock, and I fall over. Now, when I do shrooms and LSD, my balance is sharp. Like I don't become drunk, and that's what I was experienced. Like I wasn't properly keeping my balance, and so I was thinking, okay, there's something seriously wrong. And then it got in my mind that, oh my God, have we been poisoned? I don't know where these shrooms came from, or at least one source was unfamiliar to us. So I'm like, we got to get out of here. I grab Laura and I'm like, we got to get out of here. We got to get off the mountain. We need to get some water. I think we may have been poisoned. So we're like running back assuming the way that we came, and then we end up going around in a circle and coming right back to that lake again. And then I start seriously panicking, and I couldn't imagine what my face would have looked like. I'm just dripping in sweat and horror, my face white, and I'm like, we need to puke up these shrooms. I think we might be poisoned. So we gather under this shrub, and we're like gagging ourselves to try to make ourselves puke, which is impossible. And then these three hikers come hiking. And I knew, like, I have to treat this as, like, maximally, concerning. So I as embarrassed as I am to have to do this, I go up to them and tell them that we need help. I think we've been poisoned. We need water. They give us some water, and they help us down the trail. Now, it's an intermediary trail, right? So parts were like you had to like pull yourself up with a rope to continue up the path. I don't remember at all going down that path. I remember glimpses of it. Somehow I made it down to the bottom of that path without a scratch on me. And the whole way I was just floating on air. Because as soon as I recognized, okay, this is the best I can expect. There's people helping us. There's nothing more that I can do to ensure that, like, they're gonna eventually get us to a hospital. So, things are going in the right direction. There's no sense trying to worry, right? We're going in the right direction. I experience one of them. I don't know what it was that they did say that I interpreted this way, but one of them explained to me that I wasn't going to make it, that I was having signs of organ failure, and I have minutes to live. So make your terms with reality, because you're not going to make it. They didn't say that of Laura. So I had this experience of, and I had died before on shrooms. It's an interesting story, but this one's much more interesting. I'm saying thank you to the universe for the experience that it gave me, and just feeling incredible gratitude. I don't want to waste these last moments of experience that I have before I say goodbye. And then all of a sudden I can hear voices of my coworkers from work talking about me, saying nice things about me, but in the past tense, about how I was a great guy, and oh yeah, do you remember that? And I'm hearing my coworkers talking about me once I'm gone. And then after that, then now I'm hearing the voices of like my nieces and nephews and other people that I know talking about me. And what became clearer was that at the number of voices, and these are more like thoughts, I can feel the meaning of what they're saying rather than just audible sounds of voices. The number grows, and it becomes apparent to me that I'm witnessing my own funeral, that these are the thoughts of people all gathered to remember me. And one of these consciousnesses stood out as my sister, and she was the one organizing the funeral. And it was so like, I couldn't write this. I couldn't just make this up myself. But my sister was telling herself to hold it together, because it's hard for me to say this without crying, to hold yourself together, because this is about Mikey, and don't let yourself, this day is about Mikey. It's not about you. Hold yourself together. You can fall apart once this is all done. So she's making sure that everything goes well. And she was trying to keep herself busy to put off, like, sitting with that her brother's gone. And so she's keeping herself busy. And my mother was in the audience, and she left early, actually. She just got up and left. And what was going through her mind was this feeling of resentment at the world, that the world had been so unfair to her, which it has. That my mom has a lot of resentment about her past and some of the abuse that she went through, and rightfully so. And this was just one more cruel thing that the world did to her. And she didn't want to she didn't talk to anyone. She didn't say a word to anyone. And then she left. And there was a point at which they're all coming to the casket. So there was a large group of people, but they were coming in smaller groups. There was my nieces came, and I remember one of them looking at a dead body and trying to wrap their head around, he was here before and he's not here. His body's right there. Like, where is he? You know? And then my father and his wife, they're both still Jehovah's Witnesses. I remember my father was putting on his public face, as he always does, being polite and nice to people. Now, there's an interesting dynamic with my father in that if I die before Armageddon, then he's guaranteed, as long as he survives Armageddon, to see me again in the new system. Because anybody who didn't die during the flood or Sodom and Gomorrah, like the direct hand of God, so Armageddon, Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood, will be resurrected during this 1,000 years after Armageddon, where everybody who didn't die during those events is resurrected, and then we rebuild the planet to be a paradise the way it was in the Garden of Eden before eating of the Tree of Knowledge. So my dad would have a sense of joy at my death. And I experienced that. I knew that there was a sense of joy that my father had, that he now had one more reason to make it to the new system. And my stepmother, I won't say a lot about her, but she was there to support my dad. I don't really have a close relationship with her. There are various reasons for that. So she didn't know me as family, really. But she takes care of my dad, and she was really concerned with my dad. And I remember mixed with that joy was a similar feeling like my sister, that, behind this face, my father also knew that the next moment that he would be alone, that he would collapse, that this would, destroy him. Not completely destroy him, but he would collapse. Like he was anticipating with kind of, not dread, but anticipating that I haven't dealt with this. Like the first moment I have alone to sit with this, I'm going to feel this. And so those were the highlights of people visiting me. I can actually, those are the ones that I remember, because they were very, very so realer than real. And then after that, I find myself like I'm on a table, an examination table, being examined by these two beings that are like engineers that they're tinkering with the structure of my mind. And my mind is this massive expanse, this massive space, and they're like moving around these giant objects. And they've explained to me that I've been extracted too soon. I've been extracted from a simulation before I was supposed to have been. That there was some kind of glitch that they were fixing that had it such that I was pulled out of the simulation too soon. And what I gathered from what I gathered from them, because they weren't talking with words, I was feeling the meaning of their words. I'm not sure that these beings actually spoke in audible sounds. What I gathered was that they're either some future civilization or some greater civilization or even one in another possible world. And what they do is they run ancestry simulations. They run simulations of past histories, and they farm all the conscious beings that arise in these simulations. So they just run simulations of universes, and the ones that end up with conscious beings, they keep. The ones that aren't going to go there, they shut down. And at the last moment of consciousness of every being, they extract a copy of that being out into their world. So for every being that dies, they have a next moment extracted from that simulation. So they run all these simulations to farm possible conscious beings, and then they extract them at their last moment of consciousness. And what I gather happened to me was that I didn't die. I was high on shrooms, and I died in my consciousness, but not in my physical reality. Oh, by the way, before I found myself on the table, there's actually a transition period. We made it to the bottom of the hiking trail, and we come out from underneath the canopy, and the sunlight was just burning bright, and there's this great light, and there's people sort of materializing or walking alongside me, just sort of materializing beside me, all walking towards this light. And remember, this is all happening parallel to me actually walking down a trail. And they ask us, so you could sit in your car and for hours and calm down. We're going that direction. So if you still want to go to the hospital, we can drive you to Whistler and drop you off there if you still want to go. And I'm like, yes. So we get in the car, and the experience of driving down the highway in the car was like me going through a wormhole. So I went from the funeral to walking towards this light along with these other like souls, walking towards this light. Then I go into a wormhole, and then I find myself on an examination table. And this is while I'm still in the car that this examination is happening. So they're explaining this glitch to me that they're fixing by moving these giant expanses around, and the giant objects in this giant expanse of my mind to fix this glitch. And while that's happening, some other beings like them gather around to see this novel thing, which is this extracted being. And what was novel and exciting to them, it was really interesting that and exciting for them that I got extracted too soon, because one of them said to me, "Everything is okay. Everything is so okay." And what they were talking about, they explained to me, one of the engineers explained to me, is that now that I've been extracted, they don't have to put me back in. I'm here, right? So I can stay. And what I felt was novel to the people that gathered around was that they were looking at a conscious being that knew the experience of fear, of actually feeling like part of a story that could end badly, right? That had danger, that I knew what it was like to feel threat to my safety. They didn't know what that was like. In their world, that doesn't happen, right? The whole story of Michael Keeling was a fiction run in a simulation, and they don't know what it's like to be under threat, to not know where your next meal is coming from, or feeling like you might die or fall off a cliff or whatever. They don't know what that's like. That's what was really novel to them. So they disperse, and for some time, those engineers continue to work on what they're working on. And then at one point they say, okay, we're finished. Now, and they start talking very formally in saying, now we have to give you the option to go back. You're here now, so you can stay, but we have to give you the option to go back and live out the rest of your life the way that it would had the glitch not happened. We have to give you that option. And I can tell that they're not supposed to influence my decision, but behind their like formality, they're thinking to themselves like, don't be an idiot, you're already here, right? Like, why would you go back and subject yourself to that when you're already here, you're saved? And I replied to them, I'm like, well, it's not a race, right? Like, I'm going to end up here anyways. And they just repeated the question. Do you want to go back or do you want to stay here? They're not allowed to influence my decision. So I said, okay, well, I say, put me back. I want to go and live out the rest of my life knowing that this is where I'll end up. I want to see what life is like knowing this. And so they say, okay, we'll dial you back in. And that's when I started waking up to the people who drove me there saying, okay, there's the hospital. Are you sure you want to go in there? That's not going to be a fun experience. You're going to be okay. And being this high on shrooms inside of a hospital is not going to be fun. Are you sure you want to do that? Or do you want to just, walk it off? And then I was like, I want to walk it off. I get out of the car, and the environment of downtown Whistler starts like digitally filling itself in, like the rendering of a computer program. The like horizon is slowly filling in as the space expands. It's like rendering a program, very digital like. So me and Laura start sort of walking around the circle of the center of White Rock, and groups of people who are walking along with us start rendering in. So sort of forming themselves into my environment. Very digital-like. Until I had fully recovered. I was still high, but the graphics had rendered on the program. And that was, what year would that have been? 2005, I think. The summer of 2005. And then the history of this world that I was dialed back into from 2005 to today. Not the right world. They dialed me back into fucking bizarro world.
Yeah.
Right? I seriously question, at some possible world, that's a real event that happened to a real guy that ended up in this consciousness, and I'm identical to that person, right? And is it in fact the case that I was extracted from a simulation, dialed back into a simulation, but I have changed that simulation by my presence that has totally caused the whole thing to turn into fucking Biff world from, Back to the Future 2. Sometimes I question, did they dial me back in wrong? Did they dial me to the wrong simulation? Maybe the reason why they thought that it's not a good idea, maybe they hadn't done it before, those guys, right? I'm sure this glitch is rare. Maybe they didn't know that if you dial that guy back in, shit gets fucked up. I question sometimes. And there have been many times where, I live my life as if that was a hallucination, right? But I also know that there is a me at which it was a real history that still ends up with this moment of consciousness. And they're equally, there's histories that lead to this moment of consciousness where that did happen, and there's histories where it didn't. And I act as if it didn't, because I would go insane if I acted as if I had no, I got extracted, I'm living in a simulation. But I do entertain that idea, right? I keep multiple maps of the world, and one of them is I'm living in a simulation. If you're familiar with the simulation argument, there's plenty reason to think that the chances that you're not living in a simulation are vanishingly small, because if beings in any universe could simulate other universes, there would be orders of magnitude more simulated universes than actual universes. The chances that you're going to find yourself in an actual one are vanishingly small.
Right. So
the idea that I'm living in a simulation is pretty statistically well founded. So it's nothing to scoff at, the idea. And it was realer than real, what happened. So several times I've thought to myself, why did I take the blue pill? But it definitely, the experience of knowing this helps, because the world is so fucked up, and I still have that voice telling me that everything is going to be okay, and I trust that voice. And I consult that compass of the maximally great Michael Keeling, whatever Michael Keeling turns out to be a trillion years from now. I try to live by that compass, and it's a form of faith, right? And at the same time, I can still navigate my world from a scientific skeptic, like Bayesian reasoning way of navigating the world, while still consulting this compass and having faith that everything's going to be okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you very much, Michael.
No problem.
This was great.
That was fantastic. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.